And we come to the part of the show that I know a lot of people like to watch. And this is when we talk about the top three things that individual investors should be focused on before they make their investment decisions. And I think for this show, we actually have a few different topics. Normally, we talk about the Fed and economic data, but this time, because of the way the world is moving today, the economies are moving. It's moving a lot on and with respect to trade. So, what are our headlines today? First one, looking for the next big announcement or trade deal announcement. There are announcements coming out of the US on a daily basis, sometimes from hour to hour. Different businesses, different announcements out of the White House on tax, on trade, on tariffs. It's a whirlwind of activity, definitely. So that's something I want to touch on today. Be mindful of which sectors are in the US president's crosshairs. Which sectors of the market is President Trump focusing on? And as he would say, focusing on fixing that he thinks are not working properly, that he would issue an executive order to, and that may affect these sectors. We're going to highlight a few sectors that I think are in the president's crosshairs that you may want to avoid or at least underweight in your portfolio at this time. And our last point, one that we seem to always talk about, NVIDIA earnings. NVIDIA earnings will come out towards the end of this month, and they're obviously very important. NVIDIA right now, not the largest company in the world at this point. Microsoft has taken that number one spot, but NVIDIA is right behind, becoming once again a $3 trillion company. We've seen the stock price surge to $130 and beyond this morning. And with NVIDIA making trade deals, most recently Saudi Arabia, and the hyperscalers, the companies like Amazon, for example, still buying billions and billions of dollars worth of chips. This is a name that we all need to focus on. So let's get to our first topic, which is trade deal announcements or announcements out of the White House. I think this is something that individual investors need to focus on because any announcement of some sort of trade deal will definitely move markets. And our first headline actually comes from a statement, NVIDIA statement on reports of Trump administration AI policy change. And here it is. We welcome the administration's leadership and new direction on AI policy, with the AI diffusion rule being revoked. And I'll explain what that is. America will have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to lead the next industrial revolution and create high-paying U.S. jobs, build new U.S. supplied infrastructure, and alleviate the trade deficit. And if I'm not mistaken, I heard Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, make this statement. And what the diffusion rule was, President Biden put in this rule, and the rule was basically that they were going to divide the world into three pools. Number one would be allies, the countries that the United States consider their closest allies. They'd be able to get the best chips out of the US, the fastest chips, most powerful chips to do what they needed to do. The next grouping of countries may not have been the closest allies, but allies nonetheless, nothing, no ill will between the US and this group of countries. And so they would be willing to get, or President Biden said they could get the next best chips, maybe not the best of the best, but maybe the second best, so not as powerful. And the third grouping of countries would be the countries that the U.S. considers an enemy, not an ally, and they wouldn't be able to get any chips. So this was how President Biden, called it the diffusion rule. Well, what the U.S. has done now is said, basically, we're doing away with the diffusion rule. We're going to let companies like AMD and NVIDIA be able to negotiate with any country that they want. And there will be certain countries like China, for example, that if you want to do business with China, you will need a license to do so. So they're controlling it based on this idea of gaining a license. The government will issue a license with respect to what type of chips you're sending to places like China. And that's how they're going to monitor the situation. So definitely a headline that move markets, is helping the chip makers. And it's something that individual investors need to keep in mind or be mindful of. Another headline, or in this case, a trade deal announcement, was the trade deal between the US and UK. And we have an illustration that talks about that. There it is. So when that headline came out, I believe in the Oval Office, the president brought the Prime Minister of the UK on the phone and they talked about the deal, and the market loved it. Market moved higher that day. You can see here, new market access for the United States, $5 billion. They can also, interesting enough, if you look at the far right-hand side of that illustration, they now have a 10% tariff on the UK, whereas before they had a 3.4% tariff. So they've actually will bring in revenue from the UK, even though they have a trade deal, or more revenue from the UK, which is, I thought was interesting. On the other side, the UK had a 5% tariff, and now they're going to have less than 2%. So it looks like when you look at this kind of deal, and I've said this before, where exactly did the UK win? I'm not so sure, because they're going to be paying higher tariffs, and they're letting the US pay lower tariffs to gain access to their country. Unprecedented access to the UK market. There you have it. Ethanol, beef, cereals, fruit, vegetables, a whole list of things that they will have access to their markets. Steel and aluminum trading union, tariffs and quotas, and all the information right there for you. Secure supply chains and pharmaceuticals. One of the things the UK benefits is on automobiles. They're going to be able to ship automobiles into the US at only a 10% tariff rate, whereas right now, if you ship autos to the US, everyone else is paying a 25% tariff rate. So a lot of the unions, a lot of the car manufacturers like GM and Ford, not too happy about that, because if they bring in a car from a Canadian plant, 25% tariff. If the UK brings in a car, it's only 10% tariff. So there was a few ruffled feathers when that announcement was made. So definitely want to keep abreast of these trade deals, trade announcements in general. I think they're going to be big. As I said, an announcement this morning with Boeing, 160 planes or over 200 planes when it all is said and done. Deal with Qatar for Boeing, and we've seen the stock of Boeing move significantly higher as of late. Our second point that we wanted to be mindful of with respect to investors making individual investments into different areas is this whole idea of who's in the crosshairs of the president at this point. We've heard a lot of announcements, a lot of executive orders, but going forward, where do we think it would be a little bit difficult to move into for investment purposes? Maybe you want to be underweight or have no investment in some of these areas. And I want to talk, the first one I want to talk about is pharmaceuticals. And recently, we've heard the president talk about, we can bring up the U.S. pharmaceutical ETF. There it is. Pharmaceuticals have had a tough time in the markets, stock market for this year. Last year, pharmaceuticals have been kind of out of favor for a little while. That recent surge you see on that chart, a lot of it had to do with Eli Lilly and their GLP-1s, their weight loss drugs, diabetes, etc. Eli Lilly makes up a huge part of this pharmaceutical ETF. So when you do see a surge, sometimes it's based on just a few of these pharma companies, but the majority of them have definitely been struggling. But recently, as I was saying, the president has said he wants to see drug prices down. And he put an executive order saying that the United States, the people that live in the US, should not pay more for their drugs than than the country that is costing their people the lowest amounts for the same drugs. So what does that mean? Well, if the UK, a drug here in the United States is more expensive than, let's say, in Canada or in the UK or somewhere else, then the United States put an executive order saying that that drug has to have their price lowered to match what it is in Canada or the UK or any other country. So they're going to shop around the world, see where this drug is priced the cheapest, and the US must match. Now, stocks of a lot of these pharmaceutical companies dropped initially, but then surged forward. And why is that? Well, we quickly realized that it's the middlemen, the pharmacy benefits managers, the ones that set the pricing. They're the ones that were going to be affected most, not necessarily the drug makers themselves. So that was the first thing we realized. And secondly, you don't have to necessarily drop the prices of drugs in the US if you raise the price of drugs in those other countries. So if Pfizer raises the cost of their drugs in the UK or in Canada, then they don't necessarily have to drop the price in the US because they will match. So it's more of a equalization, I think, as the president called it, for pharmacy, but definitely pharmaceuticals are and have been, at least as of late, in the crosshairs of the president. The next chart we have is on energy, and I believe energy or oil, oil is down again today. That has been in the crosshairs of the president. Now, he may not agree or admit to it, but all he talks about is trying to lower oil prices, energy prices, so that he can bring down inflation, because he knows his other policies, reduction of tax, deregulation, tariffs, that increases inflation. So he wants to try and offset it with a decrease in energy and fuel costs. So we've seen on this chart, you can see price of oil actually starting to move higher. And that is based on the idea that trade negotiations are happening. And if trade negotiations are happening, that would be a good thing for global GDP, and oil moves up based on that. But in my opinion, make no mistake about it, I think that's a short-term phenomenon, and I would not be surprised to see oil fall back below the $60 a barrel mark. Another area I believe is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration is this retail companies like Target, Home Depot, Walmart. And why I say that, again, it's more of an indirect effect, and that's because these companies get a lot of their supply or their product overseas. China, number one. And so putting tariffs on these companies definitely causes many of us who own these stocks to have seen a pretty, I guess, poor return, to say the least, on many of them, whether it's Target or even the Walmarts of the world have seen their stocks fall, etc. And again, recently, as you'll see on this chart, things started to move up again because of the idea that the United States was talking to China, that hopefully a trade agreement will come out. If one doesn't, I think you'll see a reversal and this chart start to come back down. So to me, I think these are three areas, in my opinion, three areas that I've underweight for investors that you may want to consider to underweight in your portfolio: pharma, retail, areas, energy, areas that I think are in tough. Our third point, again, that we want to talk about before individual investors make their investment decisions, and this is the idea of NVIDIA and their earnings that are coming out shortly. NVIDIA earnings will be released in the next week or two, and as being the largest chip maker in the world, $3 trillion in assets, this is going to be a market mover. If NVIDIA says earnings are slowing, revenues are slowing, that will definitely not be good for other chip makers. That would not be good for chip equipment makers and tech as a whole. We have a couple of charts here to round off our segment. One is NVIDIA, one-year chart. You can see the steep increase. I think NVIDIA is up like 40% in the last, let's call it, month or so. Unbelievable run. If you look at it on a 5-day chart, which is our next chart here, you'll see that it's done exceptionally well as well. So NVIDIA earnings are coming up. Keep one eye on that. I think you want to be mindful of where the president or what the president says with regards to other sectors in the market. And you want to look at where or listen for the next announcement on a trade deal. I think those are the three things individual investors should be focused on over the next few weeks.